number one, why wasn't there a prosecutor for crimes against children? And number two, did anything happen or what was going on that made the DA's office want to focus on this?
Bob Wilson was frustrated that there were cases that were not being prosecuted, and those that were being prosecuted were lost when a child had been a victim. And
why? What was going? Why is that?
Well, there were. It takes experience to learn how to communicate with a child who's been harmed, and it also takes experience in how to present that child to a jury, and then how to argue on behalf of the victim before that jury. So if you're just a regular trial lawyer, you don't get that experience, but maybe once or twice, 3 times a year. If you focus one prosecutor on all those, and also by one prosecutor focusing on it, you have more cases that are going to be prosecuted. We were, and I was one of the guilty parties, dismissing these cases because it was only the word of the child against the word of the adult. We didn't know how we could show that the child was truthful and that she or he had been harmed.
J.Tom Morgan. Since 1984, he has had one primary duty.
Prosecute exclusively cases of child sexual assault for Bob Wilson, the district attorney of DeKalb County. These cases range anywhere from simple child molestation involving fondling to aggravated and sodomy and rape of children. In 1980, our office prosecuted 12 cases of child sexual assault. Last year, we prosecuted over 150 cases of child sexual assault involving 174 children. The average age of the child was 7.
There was also a time in the country that we were all starting to wake up, and not just in Georgia, but everywhere else, that these cases were for real. Children were being abused, and that we needed to do a better job. So I was fortunate to be with a group of young lawyers at the time, prosecutors from other states, and we put our heads together, and we also got some laws changed.
What's an example? Because I think one of the questions I was going to ask is, what is it like to interview a 4-year-old on the stand? And then, because I could see how that could not go well, having kids myself, but they've been through trauma. What was that like for you? But also, then what did you realize you had to do on the advocacy side as you started realizing what children were saying and as you believe children?
The difficulty of prosecuting a case with a 4-year-old would be getting that child to testify. Sometimes we had corroborating evidence other than the child's word, but we would dismiss a case because we didn't think we could get the child to talk. And you have to put more time and energy in working with that child so the child will trust you. But I did not put the 4-year-old on the stand. I put the 4-year-old on the floor with me in front of the jury. But the 4-year-old was looking at me and was not looking at the jury. But the jurors could hear everything she said. I said that case would not have been won without corroboration, but it would never have been tried if we could not put the child through the testimony.
Defense attorney will try to argue that children are very gullible, children are very easy to manipulate, therefore they can be coached to say things that actually didn't happen to them. Well, Lee, are you ready? Okay, let's go. My own experience has been that very rarely do children lie about child abuse. Aaliyah, let me show you how it's going to work.
On the day before the trial, Prosecutor Morgan brings Aaliyah to the courtroom and prepares her for what's ahead.
Okay, your dad is going to be right here. You understand? Don't look at him. What have I always told you to tell me?
To tell the truth.
That's right.
We were also we copied a statute out of Washington State. Georgia was the second state in the country to pass it, that allows hearsay statements from children to their therapists if the therapist, the forensic interviewer, is qualified and the child is available to testify. Because children are no different than any of us. They want to get past the trauma. Things that hurt, we want to put them in the back of our mind. So a forensic interviewer would interview a child, hours after she or he first disclosed. And then by the time we got to trial, it's 2 years later, and that child doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't want to remember it. But if we taped it, recorded that interview, we could play the interview to the jury as long as the child was available to testify. That probably was the biggest difference in when I started than when I finished, was we were able to find ways to get the child's story to the jury without 100% relying on the child.
We videotape that child. That videotape goes through the criminal justice system. The officers use the videotape to draw the warrants. I use the videotape to review the case and to draw the indictment. The investigators use the videotape to help investigate, so the child is not re-interviewed time and time again about something as intimate and personal as sexual abuse.
And at this point, you're not even 30 years old. Tell me what did you learn about having young kids while you were doing this? There's a story about a Christmas tree that I think you used in some closing arguments.
One of the arguments is that children's memory does not hold. Something happens to a child when she's 4 years old. How on earth can she remember, when she's 5? And I would talk to therapists, I would talk to child psychologists, and they say yes, children do remember, especially traumatic events, and sometimes the happiest events as well. But trauma is something that stays with the child. Sometimes you got to dig it out. And when you were 4 years old, I was taking the used Christmas tree to the recycle lot. I love putting the tree up. I hate taking the tree down. Your mother insisted that it was time to get the tree to the recycling lot. It was the last day. She had a meeting. I strapped the tree I thought I had on top of the minivan. You were in the car seat, and as I was driving down the road, the tree fell off. I pulled over, and I'm sure I said some expletive as the tree fell off the car. And when I picked that tree up and threw it in the ditch. And when I got back in the car, I looked at you and I said, "Don't you ever tell your mama what happened to that Christmas tree." And you didn't, and so now you are 5 years old, and when you and I are going to pick out the tree to put up, and you're still in the car seat, and as we're driving into the tree lot, you said, "Daddy, do you remember when the tree fell off the car?" And what children do remember.
You have mentioned that you went to every single autopsy of a child in that time frame, that you were really intimately connected with these families, with their experiences, and you had young children yourself. How did that happen, and what was that like?
This was a time when we had unexplained deaths of children. And this was before protocols required when there was an unexplained death of a child. And there was a famous case that we were involved in where a child we now know was murdered. And 20 years later, we did the autopsy, and the child had bilateral skull fractures. And we prosecuted the stepfather, who is now serving life in prison. And at that time, it was just an unexplained death. So we got a protocol that required anytime a child died without an obvious cause, such like a car wreck or a disease, an unexplained death. We back then called them crib deaths, because the story was that we looked in the crib and the child was dead. That
which does happen.
Which it does happen, but you've got to rule out other possibilities.
Yeah.
Sometimes a child dies and we do not know why. It's a tragic, horrible event. But there's also ways that a child can be harmed that you cannot tell just by looking at the child. A shaken baby can be shook so hard that it'll create subdural hematomas, what we call a brain bleed, and you don't know that unless you do the autopsy. We decided that the best way to explain this to a jury was to observe ourselves, and we had a very good, and he's still there, Dr. Jerry Gowett, the medical examiner for DeKalb County, was one of the early doctors to recognize this phenomenon and that these deaths can only be determined cause of death by an autopsy. And so he allowed me, as well as others on our child abuse unit, we had to go get all our hepatitis shots. Of course, we were there to observe, not to do anything else. Maybe ask questions of Dr. Gowan because he's very easy, but our job was to observe and let him teach us. I think by doing that, Caroline, we were better able to explain it to a jury about how this happened and what you see. Many of those photographs from those autopsies and autopsies themselves are images that will be seared in my mind. But at the same time, I think I was a better lawyer, a better advocate for the dead child after having seen the autopsy. And it was really because of that I ended up at Derwin's autopsy.
You say seared in your mind. What are some memorable, horrific moments that you still think about?
There was one case where a father took a hatchet and crushed the skull of his wife and two of his children. And when I went into the autopsy room, there's not just one table in the autopsy room, because sometimes there are multiple deaths. And so the images of those two children and the mom were crushed skulls, or it's an image I will never forget. Also, images of.
Stop you. Not just never forget. What feeling does that lead to, or what situation in which you would think about those?
I remember thinking when I saw the mother and two children with the crushed skulls from the hatchet, that what kind of evil would possess a person to do that to your spouse and your children? Domestic violence, just like child abuse, we understand a lot more, or we're a lot more aware of it. Not sure we'll ever quite understand it. But a man killing a spouse is unfortunately not that uncommon. But for a man to kill his spouse and his children, but we see that now, Caroline, more. The man who killed his wife and 4 of his children in Louisiana just last month. That was new to me. I could not imagine, having 2 children wanting any harm to come to them. And again, it's still a question that boggles my mind. Like, how could you do this to your own flesh and blood? I think the other thing I learned from the autopsies is how a perfectly looking baby, an infant, who looks like he or she is just soundly asleep, is dead because of a head trauma. And so that I can understand, before we had the protocols requiring autopsies, how so many child deaths were probably caused by abuse that went undetected.
Yeah. You wrote in the book that you feared your objectivity could be compromised because you'd think about me.
A prosecutor's job is to strive for justice, not to convict. And justice sometimes means that even when you know that someone is guilty of a crime, the prosecutor's ethics requires that you be able to prove the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and the prosecutor not go forward unless there's a reasonable likelihood of conviction. Now, that's a very subjective standard. Every prosecutor has a different view on what how you apply that standard, but that is the law. And I became concerned as you became a little girl, walking, talking, going to school, that if anything happened to you, I would forget that standard and I would do harm to anybody that hurt my children. And even if, the prosecutor couldn't prove it, I said that, it's now time for me to move on and let somebody else take over.
When I was walking home from school in 1st grade and someone approached me to try to put me in their car, and you had taught me to throw my backpack and to run in the opposite direction towards noise. And I was 6 or 7.
Yeah. And that's a perfect example of, my fear that something happened to my own children. And it also made me aware as a parent that I was much more cognizant about how parents would trust their child with me in the criminal justice system to get justice. And at the same time, I realized how difficult it is to get justice, especially on behalf of children. And could I be that kind of parent? And I said, no, I couldn't be that kind of parent. I would do whatever it took to protect my child.
You ended up teaching people all over the world and all over this country things that you had learned. When I think my first 48 hours appearance, I was 4 years old. And you were on the Today Show and CNN, and you were on Oprah talking about what you have learned and how important it is to believe children. I think the other thing is how important it is to create a safe space for children who've been abused to heal and grow and be protected while you're seeking justice.
The biggest difference in our ability to prosecute crimes against children, and I'm talking about child sexual abuse cases, not physical abuse, was the invention of the Child Advocacy Center. The first one was in Huntsville, Alabama. Bob Wilson and I went and viewed that one and said, we can do the same thing in DeKalb. So with Bob's leadership, and he and I joined together, we got other leaders in the community. We formed an advocacy center, and the major role there was to have an independent forensic interviewer, not a police officer, not a defense worker, somebody who was trained to interview children about child sexual abuse, which is not something you innately learn. And because of that, we were able to use those forensic interviews, the recordings in court. That was relatively new. When the first one was Huntsville, I think we had the second or third one in the country. And timing is everything. And because of that, and the experience I had prosecuting these cases, I was invited to share my experiences and try to train prosecutors throughout the country and other countries as well. And we prosecuted the first Catholic priest in the country to be convicted and go to prison for child abuse. And this was long before Spotlight. We had no idea about the epidemic that was going on in the clergy at the time. But that got a lot of attention. I prosecuted a child psychiatrist who secretly recorded his sessions with his victims. All his victims were male, and we had hundreds of hours of recordings. And so, Quantico in Virginia, if you've ever seen Silence of the Lambs, and I know you have because I showed it to you, there is a real place where they study sexual predators, they study serial killers. And when they heard we had these recordings, which no one had ever heard before, they invited me to come up with the recordings. I was not about to ship these recordings. I said, you can have them, but only if you pay my ticket to come up there with them. I'm not going to risk them in a mailbox. So I went up there, and also because of that, we had a better understanding of male victimization, boy victimization, which is very much not talked about, and we understand it better, and can teach others to be aware of it. And I think too that because of that, there are more boys coming forward, and there are more prosecutions, and many of the sexual predators, like John Wayne Gacy, who killed so many young boys and sexually abused them. that there are a large number of male victims out there, and we had to find ways to get them to disclose.
Mm-hmm. What do you still carry with you about this time? Like you've talked about the images seared. How does it, I mean, how do you sleep at night?
I am able to look back and say that I was very fortunate. And again, thanks to Bob Wilson's leadership in putting me in that position, to be at the right place at the right time in our country when we were just learning about these cases and what to do with them. I think that all of us who have worked with victims of child abuse, you carry emotional baggage, and that's been shown. I was among one of the many prosecutors who agreed to be interviewed by a therapist at one of our national conventions, and he came out with a study because his own wife was a child abuse prosecutor. That yes, prosecutors do carry some form of PTSD with this because again, there are images, especially images who've been physically hurt, or stories that children have told you. But at the same time, you say, well, if we didn't go through that pain and trauma, how many children would still be abused today, and we wouldn't know about it.
Cases became personal too at various points, where as you as the prosecutor seeking justice, there's also someone on the other side who's trying to not go to prison, or who is committing these crimes against their own family. What are some situations in which it became personal for you, or you became someone who would be sort of attacked or threatened as a result of your work?
Before I became a child abuse prosecutor, I was just a regular felony prosecutor. There was a case where a husband, stepfather, tried to kill his wife that he had separated from. She had separated from him. He dragged her down. He worked as a mechanic, so he got a hypodermic needle, filled it with battery acid, and tried to inject it in her. Neighbors heard her screaming. The police were called, and fortunately, she was not harmed. It was my very, very first jury trial. I'll never forget this. And it was a pretty straight up case. We charged him with attempted murder. We charged him with simple battery, and knowing that and aggravated assault, and believed that we had a very good case. The jury, however, determined that this was just a Saturday night spat between two people, and that's the way he framed it. That's the way his lawyer framed it, and that who knows, the next day they'll kiss and make up. This was long before we had any knowledge of domestic violence. That term was not even a term, Caroline. And the judge called Gwendolyn into his office and myself and told her that she needed to leave town. Very proud woman. She had a master's degree, great job in government. 2 children, one by her husband, another by a previous husband, Natasha. Natasha was a senior in high school. She said, I'm not going to pull my children out of school because of this, and I'm sure he's learned this lesson. And the judge said, no, he hasn't learned this lesson, but I'll make sure he stays in jail a year. A year passed, and he got out of jail, and he left threatening messages that he was going to kill her and then kill me because I was the one who put him in jail. And our investigator went and got a warrant for him. While he was getting the warrant, though, Mr. Gourmet showed up at his wife's house, put a bullet in her head, and then ran. And so you and your mother were put into hiding because of the threat. You were 1 month old, as I recall. And he was captured. He did not put up a fight. I was kind of hoping he would. And he pled guilty. to malice murder and got a life sentence. The again, the case haunted me so much. I thought, well, what could I have done differently? Why could I not convince the jury that this was an aggravated assault and a 20-year felony instead of a misdemeanor? Was I just too sure of the evidence? And like I said, I thought the evidence was overwhelming, as did Judge Tillman. I think the defense attorney, who was a public defender, was very shocked that the jury returned a not guilty verdict on the felony charge. Years later, and I lost track of Natasha at the time. By the way, when her mother was killed, she was a freshman at the University of Georgia, a cheerleader on the cheerleading team. And so she was told by an Athens police officer that her mother had been murdered and she needed to get home. And that's how she found out. We didn't have victim witness back then. We didn't have victim witness units. Today, the DA's office in that situation, or police would have sent a counselor instead of a uniformed officer. But you need to get home. Your mother's been killed. And I felt so bad for Natasha and how I believe the justice system had failed her, and I was part of that justice system. Years later, I left the DA's office. I'm driving to work, and I hear on national public radio that President Obama has appointed this Emory professor of poetry as a poet laureate of the country. A tremendous honor. It goes to the most esteemed poet that we have. And I'm halfway paying attention, and he said, Emory professor is Natasha Trethewey, and that's Gwendolyn's daughter. So it made me think, wow, the trauma of this young woman, and she was aware of the abuse that her mother was suffering, and kept it hidden because she was scared. And now she's a poet laureate of the country, and I think it's a question that we all cannot answer. And even though we talk about it, it's why some victims of abuse, horrible backgrounds, end up poets, and others end up drug addicts and suicides.
Or perpetuating the cycle of abuse
Yeah.
they've experienced.
Especially when there's been domestic violence.
Yeah.
If that's not interrupted, the domestic violence will continue.
Why did you stop prosecuting crimes against children?
I stopped prosecuting crimes against children. It was after 9 years. You and John were older, and I talked to other prosecutors and say, we can't do this forever. It does carry an emotional baggage, and I was feeling it, and I think that my peers who started in this around the country were also feeling it. Some of them got out earlier than I did, and so it was time to move on. Yeah. Around that time, though, Mr. Wilson decided he no longer was going to run for district attorney, and so I threw my hat in to be the next DA.